For just a few more days, it's February, which is Black History Month and also Oregon History Month, because Oregon first became a state on February 14th, 1859. Now, Black history and Oregon history aren't two things that go together often. When Oregon was first founded, the Constitution prohibited Black people from settling in the state at all. That rule was rarely seriously enforced, and there were some Black pioneers, including one in my hometown here in Eugene, who ran the streetcar system back when we had one of those. But Oregon does still have one of the lowest Black populations of any state. But what if I told you that Oregon had an unsung role in the founding of one of Black America's longest-lasting and most controversial institutions? Here, at this parking lot in Eugene, used to stand the house of the founder of the Nation of Islam. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Durian and Thimble the Doll, and welcome to Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. I think most Americans of any race are at least somewhat aware of the Nation of Islam. Occupying a space in the cultural pantheon of America, somewhere between the Black Panthers and Scientology, the Nation of Islam is controversial inside and outside the Black community. Is it a civil rights organization, an Islamic organization, a cult, a religion of its own? Could it be a hate group? The Southern Poverty Law Center has called it one, based on the members' homophobia, anti-Semitism, and Black supremacism. For a fringe movement, believed to have only 50,000 members as of the most recent estimate in 2007, and probably fewer today, the Nation of Islam has been good at publicity ever since their murky beginnings in the 1930s, and most people in the US probably have a basic working knowledge of who they are and what they do. They're the people who organized the Million Man March in DC. They're credited with the trend of Black celebrities converting to Islam and adopting Islamic names, like when Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. They're associated with Malcolm X, who is often taught in the historiography of the 1960s civil rights movement as the anti-Martin Luther King, the other leader of the movement, Yin Yang, the one who advocated violence and who the historical narrative often treats as the one who lost out compared to King, the one who isn't thought of as having been successful, unlike King. All this definitely gives the Nation of Islam a sort of mystique, but also a sense that they're dangerous or extreme or on the wrong side of history. But the Nation of Islam is a lot more than the organization that got Muhammad Ali to change his name. In fact, nation is a pretty accurate way of describing them. The NOI really is its own society within Black America. They have their own primary schools, their own distinctive lingo, their own armed forces, the fruit of Islam, who have sometimes been contracted to provide security for Black majority housing projects. Their own hierarchical authoritarian leadership structure, their own national anthem, sometimes referred to as Fight for the Nation or simply the Muslim Fight Song, their own annual holiday on February 26th, Savior's Day, their own distinctive style of dress involving suits with bow ties for men and white head coverings for women, and even their own cuisine, which is mostly vegetarian and notably includes bean pies. And of course, they have an extremely complex, extremely detailed set of religious beliefs. Where's my South Park-style title text? Yeah, here we go. Most Muslims from other sects of Islam do not consider the NOI to be truly Islamic, and their beliefs certainly are very unique. While they use Islamic terms like imams, mosques, and Allah, the NOI's scripture compares more with something along the lines of Scientology, with very 20th century pulp sci-fi elements. They hold that they are descended from the tribe of Shabazz, a group unique to the NOI's mythology, who supposedly inhabited the Middle East and North Africa for millions of years, speaking Arabic and practicing Islam. The tribe of Shabazz was in turn descended from the Council of 24 Imams, who are some kind of divine being and each take turns being Allah for a few millennia at a time. So, where do they think white people came from? Here's where things start to get a little Xenu-y. The NOI teaches that 6,000 years ago, a brilliant young scientist named Yaqub from the tribe of Shabazz began to amass a following. Before reaching 18, he discovered many of the natural laws that the NOI believes white society attributes to Sir Isaac Newton, and had gathered a movement of 60,000 disaffected Shabazzites in Mecca, which was the tribe of Shabazz's capital. Another example of the NOI's surface-level use of Islamic concepts to construct what is effectively an entirely different religion. The rest of Shabazz didn't take kindly to Yaqub, and he and his followers fled to the Greek island of Patmos, a place that interestingly also appears in the Bible. There, like many a comic book supervillain from around the time the NOI was founded, Yaqub sought to create a super race with which he would dominate the world. In a stroke of evil genius Ernst Stavro Blofeld could only dream of, he began to experiment on his own followers, selectively breeding them to be especially violent, dishonest, and light-skinned. Yaqub eventually died after centuries of practicing eugenics on Patmos, but his creation, white people, the Yaqubian devils, outlived him. They were found to be so dangerous that they were exiled to Europe, where they lived in caves and ate raw meat, far from where they could wreak havoc on the civilized tribe of Shabazz. After a few centuries, Moses went to Europe and tried to civilize the white people, in a portrayal of Moses thoroughly different from his appearance in Christian, Jewish, and mainstream Islamic scripture. In NOI lore, I guess Moses is sort of a bad guy, because as soon as he taught white people to wear clothes, they realized they could take over the world and used their animalistic strength and aggression to oppress descendants of the genetically superior tribe of Shabazz across the globe. Whatever happened to leading the Jews out of slavery in Egypt, or receiving the Ten Commandments from God? I don't think Moses does either of those things in Nation of Islam scripture, which is bizarre because that's literally the point of Moses. It's like if someone claiming to be the one true heir to James Cameron did a Titanic remake that was about a canoe that didn't sink, and wasn't even called the Titanic. The NOI believes that the evil subhuman constructs of Yaqub are still running the world. If you've ever heard someone refer to white people as Yaqubian devils, that's where that comes from. But there is hope. Soon, they say, Allah will come down to Earth in the Mother Plane, a spherical spacecraft a quarter-mile in radius, made in Japan, which will rescue all Earth's black people, then destroy the rest of humanity with nuclear weapons. Once Earth is habitable again, the victorious descendants of the tribe of Shabazz will step down from the Mother Plane and bring humanity into a golden age. With these kinds of scriptures, it should come as no surprise that many NOI members often feel a connection with Scientology, and Louis Farrakhan has recommended that members read Dianetics and undergo auditing. Along with the NOI's teaching that there is no afterlife and once you're dead, which is a rare thing for a theistic, tightly organized religion to preach, the other big issue on which the NOI is at odds with mainstream Islam is the status of Allah and other gods. Yes, the NOI considers itself monotheistic, but only in the way that the United States is mono-presidential. There have been multiple presidents, of course, but there's only one at any one given time. The NOI believes that the mantle of Allah passes from person to person along a succession of long-lived but mortal and human individuals. Like US presidents, each incarnation of Allah has shaped the world they live in because each one has different strengths and different weaknesses. It's hard to overstate how far this is from any other form of Islam, which, regardless of sect, teaches that Allah is all-powerful, greater than anything else in the universe, and certainly not human, mortal, changing, or divided in any way. The NOI claims that the reason we know the Mother Plane is coming soon is because the current incarnation of Allah, known as Wallace Fard Muhammad, has the same powers as the original God who created the universe, the one who founded the Divine Council of 24 Imams who have each taken their turn as Allah. And with that, we arrive at the end of the beginning of this episode, because Wallace Fard Muhammad, who the Nation of Islam claims was a God made flesh, really existed. He is believed to have founded the NOI in Detroit in the early 1930s. Not much more is known about him, and strangely enough, for the founder of what is probably the world's best-known black supremacist organization, he most likely wasn't even black himself. Who really was the man known as Wallace Fard Muhammad? Detroit, 1930. At this point, the city is a long way from its later reputation as a hotbed of crime and poverty, and the early 20th century public image of Detroit is almost the opposite. It's the fourth biggest city in the nation, and has become a cultural capital on the wealth brought by the new and booming auto industry. You can make a comparison between Detroit then and Austin today, maybe. Objectively, the city is booming, and the population is going through the roof as people flock there to work in the city's high-tech industries. There are megatons of money being invested there, but with it has come unrest. Older residents are being forced out, and a vast underclass of the people who work for the people who work in the city's lucrative industries has formed. Within a few decades, this underclass, in Detroit's case composed of black internal migrants from the Deep South as well as white immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, will become who Detroit is, as the auto industry automates and the city's rich move out to the suburbs or to California. For now, though, they're the side of Detroit that the rest of Detroit, otherwise nicknamed the Paris of the Midwest, doesn't want you to see. Michigan never had much of a black population until the auto industry began to develop in Detroit, and thousands of black people began to flee the rural, racist South for factory jobs in the marginally less racist North. Arriving in Detroit in the 1920s, they were met by the KKK, which likewise hadn't had much of a presence in the upper Midwest until then. With Michigan diversifying, though, thousands of white Michiganders were determined to reverse this trend. At the KKK's peak in the late 1920s, Detroit alone was estimated to have had 10,000 dues-paying members, a big percentage of the city's white Protestant population. By the time the NOI began to gain converts among Detroit's black community, the KKK activity in Michigan was past its peak, but a different kind of organized crime was still going as strong as ever. Prohibition was still in effect, and Detroit is right across the river from Canada. Every day at that point, thousands of gallons of alcohol were being smuggled into the US by Detroit gangs, both black and white. Into this maelstrom steps a curious young man, initially known as W.D. Fard or W.D. Ford. He's handsome, well-dressed, well-spoken, racially ambiguous. Contemporary news reports call him black. Other contemporary news reports call him white. The 5 known pictures of him depict a dapper man with straight black hair, European-looking facial features, and possibly brown skin, though it's obviously hard to tell in black and white photos. He could be a light-skinned black man or a swarthy Southern European white man. Or he could be Middle Eastern or South Asian or Hispanic or conceivably even East Asian. In other words, we have absolutely no idea. People who met him describe him giving wildly contradictory reports of his origin. He often said that he was from Mecca, but he also said he was descended from Russian Jews. To his black followers, he sometimes claimed that he was black, but that he had deliberately lightened his skin somehow in order to pass as white. Sometimes he said he had a degree from Oxford. While we can't be sure of anything in this guy's life, it's quite likely that in the hyper-segregated world he inhabited, being able to pass as any race was a powerful gift. The first known appearance of Ford or Fard, who was yet to add Muhammad to his name, was in Detroit's heavily black Paradise Valley neighborhood in 1930, selling silks door to door. He reportedly told buyers that he was from the ancestral homeland of black people, though he didn't say Africa, and Africa doesn't loom nearly as large in NOI lore as it does in other black nationalist ideologies, and that the silks he sold were from that homeland. People were intrigued. After all, Detroit's new and growing black community was unsettled. Almost everyone in Paradise Valley had just arrived in the city. Many had come from rural farms in the South and were unaccustomed to city life. There was a huge pent-up demand for meaning and community. Fard began preaching his loopy variant of Islam in community members' houses in Paradise Valley, gaining a following surprisingly quickly. Islam was little known in America at the time, and nobody he preached to knew enough about Islam to tell him, okay, I don't know what you're preaching, but it's not Islam. In fact, at least one new convert, a laid-off factory worker named Elijah Poole, claimed to the FBI years later that he'd never heard of Islam at all before he met Fard. Once again, only the most basic tropes of Islam, and only the ones most widely known in the West, appeared in Fard's theology. For instance, he urged his followers not to eat pork, which some of them credited with improving their health, further burnishing Fard's reputation. Whether Fard himself was more knowledgeable about Islam than he let on is unknown, but most scholars of religion agree that he probably wasn't making up everything as he went along. Some of it, sure. The mother plane and the mad scientist Yaqub creating white people out of a vat have no equivalent in any sect of Islam. And the most important features of Islam aren't present in Fard's religion. The Shahada, literally the motto of Islam, the most basic distillation of Islamic beliefs, reads, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah," and neither of those things are true or important in the NOI's scriptures. But the idea of the 24 divine imams, of which the last one will bring the end times, is too similar to a form of Shia Islam, the second largest Islamic sect, to be a coincidence. What we know is that he was extremely good at manipulating large groups of people. He was a born cult leader, gaining people's trust by first preaching homely, familiar sermons based in biblical stories with light threads of black nationalism and black separatism woven in, ideas that were already gaining currency at the time and his followers were unlikely to be unfamiliar with. Once people had come to see Fard as a trustworthy figure, he gradually began ratcheting up the crazy, repudiating the Bible and introducing out-there concepts like the myth of Yaqub to his captive audience. Whether or not Fard believed what he taught, he knew how to manipulate people. Fard's following grew until he managed to raise enough money to buy a permanent meeting space, which he called the Allah Temple of Islam. He declared that the Quran was the only authoritative text of his religion, though in practice it took a backseat to Fard's own teachings, which he required his followers to memorize. He gave his followers Islamic or Islamic-sounding names, like Shabazz, Ghulam, and Khalat. He appointed Elijah Poole as his right-hand man and renamed him Elijah Muhammad. Fard himself, previously known under a bevy of vaguely similar names that make researching him a pissin' pain in the penis, began going by Wallace Fard Muhammad, the name he's usually remembered under today. And then, in December 1932, as his movement grew, Fard had to flee Detroit after being accused of human sacrifice. On Thanksgiving Day 1932, Allah Temple of Islam member Robert Kareem, formerly known as Robert Harris, stabbed his roommate James J. Smith on a makeshift altar, justifying it with quotes from Fard's writings that said, "The believer must be stabbed through the heart," and "Every son of Islam must gain a victory from a devil." Kareem was ruled not guilty by reason of insanity, and Fard insisted his writings were metaphorical, which he had pretty good standing to claim. After all, who would join a religion in which the believer must actually be stabbed through the heart? Reminds me of this 8-year-old boy at a summer camp where I once worked, who insisted to everyone who would listen that a really cool thing the world really needed would be a roller coaster that kills you. Nonetheless, Fard recognized that regardless of his intentions, he was causing a bit of a moral panic, inside and outside the black community in Detroit, and he disbanded the Allah Temple of Islam and fled to Chicago. But his movement wasn't dead, and this only served to spread it to black communities in other cities. Back in Detroit, under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, a successor organization, the Nation of Islam, began to rise, which was a continuation of the Allah Temple in all but name. Fard returned after a few months of exile, and the Nation of Islam developed into a much more organized and autonomous society within a society. Fard created plenty of institutions that survive as part of the NOI today. To defend the group against potential future attacks along the lines of the human sacrifice scandal, he created the Fruit of Islam paramilitary force. To reduce the amount of interaction members had with outside society, he created the Mohammed University of Islam, which, despite its name, was a K-12 school. As more and more disaffected black Detroiters joined, Fard created a rigid organizational structure, with himself and Elijah Muhammad at the top. And then, in April 1934, Fard disappeared. For good. He hadn't made a public appearance in months. The Nation of Islam was no longer the collection of followers surrounding Fard, held together by his speeches, that it had started as. A lot of people who have studied the NOI say that Fard had spent his last year in charge secretly preparing the movement for his eventual disappearance by giving it a governing structure that made it clear the NOI would be able to keep going once he left. And it did. The Nation is estimated to have had 8,000 members by that point, which is incredible for a group that was founded just 4 years previously by a mysterious guy selling silks door to door. Over the next few years, with Elijah Muhammad in charge, the number of NOI members stretched into the tens of thousands, but Fard's whereabouts were unknown. Where did he go? Rumors went around that he'd returned to his mysterious home country, or that he'd been shot by police, but these were quickly quashed by Elijah Muhammad, who was the first to promote the doctrine that Fard had been God, and he had now returned to the mother plane to someday swoop down and rescue his chosen people. Where did he really go? It's conceivable that he really did go abroad, or he really did get murdered by police, though I doubt the latter because he definitely seems to have been planning to disappear all along. And here we come to the real mystery of Wallace Fard Muhammad. Why? From everything I've already said about him, he sounds like a textbook con man, and he might have been. He sure was good at taking advantage of people. But there are 3 basic reasons why someone might start a cult, and the case of Wallace Fard doesn't seem to neatly fall into any of them. Number 1, you're a con man and you're in it for the money. Number 2, you're a con man and a narcissist and you're in it to be venerated as a god. Or, number 3, you're crazy and you actually believe everything you're saying. Fard probably didn't have the first one in mind. Nobody got rich off the NOI in the group's early days. Ripping off black migrants in Detroit would be an odd choice of scam, especially given that not much later, L. Ron Hubbard showed that it would be equally easy to get people with much more money to join a cult. Unlike Scientology, the NOI never charged any fees to become a member or have sacred knowledge revealed to them, though they did charge members money to be given citizenship cards, which will become important later. Sure, Elijah and Wallace Fard Muhammad got donations from followers, but they didn't amount to much more than covering the NOI's expenses. Could Fard have gotten into the new religious movement business because he wanted to be worshipped? He certainly was worshipped, but he didn't begin to be seen as a god until after he disappeared. And if he was in it to be worshipped, why would he walk away from it? Why does it seem like his whole plan all along was to start a movement, get it going, and then leave it in others' hands once it became big enough to survive without him? Well, it's conceivable that Fard belongs in the third category. Just that he was shrewd and intelligent in his dealings with the people of Paradise Valley doesn't mean he couldn't have believed some odd things. After all, it's worth noting that the Nation of Islam wasn't the first organization to sell an idiosyncratic homegrown American religion to black people and call it Islam. The first such organization began in New Jersey in 1913. This part begins with a personal anecdote. When I was midway through elementary school, young enough to have potentially wanted to get on a roller coaster that killed me, I suffered a quick, high-intensity special interest in license plates. It's kind of weird how briefly that one lasted. My special interests definitely ebb and flow over time. The only thing I've consistently had the same amount of fixation on throughout my life has been trains, because I'm just that much of an autistic stereotype. My special interest in elections rises and falls depending on whether there are elections happening for me to follow, but has never really gone away. My music special interest hyper-focuses on a different artist every few years, but it's always there. The weird years of the Beach Boys, the Magnetic Fields, Kate Bush, then Radiohead before that, and in early high school, cringingly Arcade Fire. I'm not that interested in airline routes or schedules right now, but I'm sure that one will come back when I travel internationally again. License plates, though, those were all I thought of for about a year, and then that interest was gone like an angel's kiss. Maybe it's because there's only so much you can learn about license plates. Once you've memorized all the US, state, and Canadian province license plate designs, which I did, there aren't a lot more places your fascination can go. The idea of license plates as an art form, little ads for the state they're issued in, is uniquely North American. Everywhere else, they're just letters and numbers on a white background. It's been a long time since I was really passionate about license plates. Today, though, I still notice when I see a license plate from a faraway state, and I still long to see one in the wild from Canada's Northwest Territories, where the plates are not rectangular, but polar bear shaped. Last summer in Portland, walking down Hawthorne Boulevard, I saw a plate I wasn't familiar with. It was on a great big pickup truck parked by the street, and it had the Moroccan flag, red with a green 5-pointed star as the background. Over 13 digits, way more than on any actual American license plate. It said, Moorish American. And below the letters and numbers, where a slogan might go, it said, Private National Cultural Plate. I had no idea what Moorish American meant. The Moors were a Muslim ethnic group inhabiting medieval Spain and Morocco, but I really doubt anyone with ancestry from that area would identify as Moorish American these days. That would be a bit like someone of Turkish descent calling themselves Ottoman American, or if my family referred to our Scandinavian roots as Viking American. The Moors don't really exist anymore. I guessed that the mysterious Moorish American license plate had to be one of those fake sovereign citizen plates, the ones that cops don't bother ticketing people for because they know that if they pull over that kind of person for an invalid plate, they'll be harangued with a prepared stump speech about how the US government is a legally non-existent entity that has no power over citizens or something. And I was exactly right. Upon looking it up, I found that the license plate had been issued by the Moorish Science Temple of America, a very Nation of Islam-like outfit that predates it by almost 2 decades. The Moorish Science Temple's beliefs aren't quite as original or as weird as the Nation of Islam's. If the NOI is the Black Scientology, you could say the Moorish Science Temple is the Black Freemasonry. Like the NOI, they use Islamic terminology, despite borrowing very little from actual Islam. They have a holy book called the Circle 7 Quran, but almost all of it is taken word for word from the writings of Christian mystics in the early 20th century, as well as the writings of other esoteric, occultish, religious, and philosophical groups like the Rosicrucians, who you'll remember from my episode about the Georgia Guidestones, in which I mispronounced it Rosicrucians the whole way through. The central idea of the Moorish Science Temple is that African Americans are traditionally Muslims, and they are Muslims because they're descended from Moors. This isn't too far off from the NOI's mythology of the tribe of Shabazz, but unlike the creative, detailed, and thoroughly trippy tale of the tribe of Shabazz and the mad scientist Yaqub, I can see where the Moorish belief comes from. Even though the Moors probably weren't all that dark-skinned, they were the only remotely non-white people medieval Europeans would regularly encounter, so Moor became a generic term for a black person in England. Anyone who's read Shakespeare's play Othello recognizes this. The title character is regularly referred to as a Moor, but physical description also makes it clear that he's black, and he's probably from somewhere further south in Africa than where the Moors came from. Someone in the early 20th century, with at least some knowledge of history and geography, must have noticed this use of nomenclature and misinterpreted it to think that if black people are Moors, and the Moors are Muslim, shouldn't black people be Muslim? And that someone was Timothy Drew, known to his followers as Noble Drew Ali. Drew founded the Moorish Science Temple in 1913 in Newark, New Jersey, a city that didn't have much of a black population at the time. Drew's backstory is also a bit of a mystery, though not nearly as much as Wallace Fard Muhammad's. We know that Drew was African American and possibly part Cherokee, and we're pretty sure he was born in 1886 in North Carolina. The gaps in his past are pretty normal for a black person in America at this time in history. As Ralph Ellison later wrote, you could be an invisible man. Most black people didn't have much official documentation of their existence, so the relative lack of documentation of Timothy Drew's life isn't quite as odd as the complete lack of documentation of the distinctive, luminously weird Wallace Fard Muhammad. Drew began gaining followers after he moved his temple to Chicago in 1925. The Great Migration was now in full swing, and just like Wallace Fard Muhammad just a few years later, Drew was able to get converts among the thousands of unsettled black people who had just recently arrived there from the South. Among his new converts may have been the future Wallace Fard Muhammad. While there is no scholarly consensus on this, today many Fard biographers claim that alongside his few years in Detroit, the only other thing we know about his life is that in the late 1920s, under the name David Ford, the future Wallace Fard Muhammad was a high-ranking figure in the Moorish Science Temple of America. David Ford was described as the only member of the Moorish Science Temple who wasn't black, referred to as having potentially East Indian features, similar to Fard's appearance, by other followers. There weren't a lot of Indian or Indian-looking people in America at the time. He lived in Chicago, a city Wallace Fard Muhammad was known to have connections to, and he used the surname Ford and a common Anglo first name, which fit with many of the names Fard was known to go by in Detroit. The smoking gun, though, is that when Noble Drew Ali died of pneumonia in 1930 without leaving a successor, David Ford tried to take over the Moorish Science Temple, declaring himself to be Drew's reincarnation. He drew a substantial number of followers, but the followers of the other successor claimant, Charles Kirkman Bey, outnumbered David Ford's followers, and Kirkman Bey excommunicated Ford and his followers from the Moorish Science Temple. Ford vanished soon afterward. Just a few months before, a man with a similar appearance and name began knocking on doors in Detroit, preaching a creed very much like that of the Moorish Science Temple. Anyway, even if we accept Fard as having been a member of the Moorish Science Temple in the late 1920s, that still doesn't leave us much closer to unraveling the mystery of this man. Where did he come from? What country could he have been from? Those who knew him say he spoke with a white American accent, pretty different from the accent of most of the black people he preached to, but not foreign sounding. He claimed fluency in Arabic, though historians say there's not a lot of evidence for that. Nobody who was in his presence ever reports hearing him speak Arabic, and while he gave out NOI citizenship cards to his followers that included their name handwritten in Arabic script on them, some people who actually speak Arabic say the Arabic on the cards is damn near illegible, and he could have just cracked open an English-Arabic dictionary and looked at the letters that correspond to each other. Entire books have been written claiming that Fard was from British India, or that he was from Turkey, or Algeria, or Afghanistan, or Bosnia, or Greece, or really anywhere with a Muslim population. For whatever Muslim majority country you can think of, someone has asserted that the circumstantial evidence points to Wallace Fard Muhammad having come from there. When I first went down this rabbit hole, I didn't think he was from an Islamic country at all. I sincerely doubt that anyone who's actually familiar with Islam would teach his followers about mad scientists and world-saving spacecraft and call that Islam, let alone the idea of a sequential procession of gods and no afterlife, which are totally antithetical to Islam. Almost all of the actually Islamic elements of Fard's Nation of Islam teachings are the sort of thing you'd read about Islam in a children's guide to the world sort of book. They read the Quran. They pray 5 times a day, facing Mecca. They don't eat pork. They worship a single god called Allah. The early Nation of Islam did not really include any other foundational elements of Islam, like the 5 pillars or even the veneration of the original Prophet Muhammad, even though plenty of early NOI members added Muhammad to their names. The NOI scripture really sounds like the work of someone with a great imagination mansplaining Islam based on the few things they already know about it. I think it's far more likely that Fard grew up somewhere without a lot of Muslims, like, say, Oregon. And I'm not just saying Oregon because that's where I am. No, the only promising, anywhere close to credible reconstruction of Fard's potential background anyone's come up with holds that he was possibly born and definitely spent much of his life here in Oregon. This episode has come home. In the 1950s, the FBI saw the then-growing Nation of Islam, still led by Elijah Muhammad at that point, as a threat. So they did what they later did to innumerable other civil rights figures. They investigated the hell out of them. I recognize that this probably means they aren't an extremely reliable source, but nevertheless I believe that what they found is accurate, because they didn't find much. They went looking for dirt on Fard and came up only slightly less empty-handed than the rest of us. If they had wanted to make things up about Fard, they would have made up more. The FBI found 2 potential jumping-off points from which to explore the pre-1926 life of Wallace Fard Muhammad, 2 people who had enough circumstantial evidence to link them to Fard. The first Fard sighting, as it were, was the marriage certificate of a man named Wally Dodd Ford and a woman named Carmen Trevino in Santa Ana, California in 1924. Trevino was a Mexican citizen. Both she and Ford listed their race as, quote, Spanish. Ford claimed he was 26 years old and that he'd been born in Portland, Oregon, to parents from Madrid named Zaradod and Babje, which are the most Spanish-sounding names I've ever heard, for one. Along with the guy's name, Wally Dodd Ford, all three of which were names Fard commonly used in his mix-and-match set of aliases he later used in Detroit, the strange names that Wally Dodd Ford claimed belonged to his Spanish parents were the key linking this man to Wallace Fard Muhammad, because Zaradod and Babje, which sound to me like the names of a 4-year-old's imaginary friends, were exactly the names Fard would later tell Elijah Muhammad were his parents' names. The other person who was a match for Wallace Fard Muhammad, as well as Wally Dodd Ford, was an inmate at San Quentin State Prison in Northern California, who'd been arrested in Los Angeles on February 15, 1926, on a charge of selling narcotics out of a downtown LA restaurant that he owned. This man's listed name was Wallace Dodd Ford. His race was listed as white this time, and once again he was said to have been born in Portland, this time to Zared and Beatrice Ford, slightly more normal names, I guess, but definitely similar to Zaradod and Babje. He claimed they were both born in Hawaii, and that Zared was ethnically British, while Beatrice was a native Hawaiian. Wallace Dodd Ford's fingerprints and mugshot were a perfect match for Wallace Fard Muhammad, who they had fingerprints on file for because he had been arrested a few times in Detroit for disturbing the peace. So, now that the FBI had 2 data points from which they were able to triangulate some information about Fard's past, that in the mid-1920s he'd been dealing drugs in California, claiming to be from Oregon and/or Spain and/or Hawaii, they went looking for other mentions of this man in legal documents from the era. They found a few more pieces of evidence which they were able to trace a skeletal outline of Fard's pre-NOI life from, but one that still arguably raised more questions than it answered. In the 1920 census, he popped up living in Los Angeles under the name Wally D. Ford, claiming his race as white, his age as 26, the same age he would claim to be 4 years later when he married Carmen Trevino, his job as a restaurant owner, and his birthplace, this time, as New Zealand. He lived with a common-law wife named Hazel E. Ford. Miraculously, the FBI managed to track down Hazel E. Ford and interview her. She said that the pictures on file of Wallace Fard Muhammad were indeed her ex-husband. Earlier, in 1918, one Wally D. Ford was arrested in Los Angeles for assault with a deadly weapon, and weirder still, a 1917 World War I draft registration card lists Wally Dodd Ford as a white Los Angeles restaurateur, just like his 1920 census listing, but names his birthplace as Shinka, Afghanistan, and says he was not a U.S. citizen, but a resident alien from Afghanistan. This may have been an attempt to dodge the draft, especially since there's no real place in Afghanistan called Shinka. There is a Shinke, which some Fard biographers have cited as his most plausible birthplace, but no Shinka. Records were later discovered of a Wallace Dodd Ford moving from Portland to Los Angeles in 1916. The earliest the FBI was able to trace the mysterious, identity-shifting serial monogamist Wallace Dodd Ford was a 1914 marriage certificate to Pearl Allen, a Native American woman in Portland, Oregon. This would have made Carmen Trevino his 3rd wife. Some people have gone deeper down the rabbit hole than the FBI did. Another name this Wallace Dodd Ford person allegedly went by was Fred Dodd, in a book that might be the deepest dive anyone's done into Fard's background, Finding W.D. Fard, Unveiling the Identity of the Founder of the Nation of Islam. One John Andrew Morrow claims to have found further records of a Fred Dodd in the Pacific Northwest, who has strong circumstantial evidence toward being our guy. In the 1900 census, one Fred Dodd was listed living in Vancouver, Washington, across the Columbia River from Portland. He was 13 years old, he was white, and he'd been born in the Washington Territory to John and Ella Dodd, not long before Washington became a state in 1889. Nobody in his family seemed to be anything but white. Pearl Allen, meanwhile, who Fred Dodd married in 1914 in Salem, was a full-blooded Klamath Indian from Klamath Falls, down near the Oregon-California border. Her life is well documented in reservation records. Strange as this may seem, it's possible that in an age before interracial marriage was legal, Fred Dodd's first step on a path that brought him from a white boy from the Pacific Northwest to preaching to black Detroiters about how white people are devils may have been to falsify his race so that he could marry his high school sweetheart. Or maybe not, because their marriage was pretty shaky. This is Morrow's original discovery, though it's backed up well enough by government documents that I trust him. Fred Dodd's marriage to Pearl Allen only lasted from April to September 1914. Court documents from their divorce describe Dodd as a, quote, hardworking, sober, and industrious man, and Pearl Allen as an alcoholic who would regularly go out drinking and doing other stuff at night with, quote, strange men, some of whom might have even been foreigners. And while this may seem like Dodd trying to play the victim here and playing off the racism of his era, sure enough, just 2 months after the divorce, Pearl Allen was arrested in Salem for selling alcohol to a minor, alongside a man who was Italian. Throughout this whole contretemps, nobody ever suspected that Fred Dodd himself might be a foreigner, let alone from somewhere far more exotic than Italy. He hadn't started claiming that yet. He presumably had to claim to be something other than white to be allowed to legally marry Pearl Allen, but the court documents don't suggest what ethnicity they thought he was. Pearl Allen gave birth to a son not long after the divorce, with her new Italian boyfriend listed as the father, although it's possible that Fred Dodd was the real father, making this baby, Donald Lloyd Campagna, the child of Wallace Fard Muhammad, the only child of Wallace Fard Muhammad who survived to adulthood. Campagna certainly never learned this about himself if it was true. He died in 1983 in Idaho. Campagna had 4 children, though, who are still alive and still live in the Northwest, and in this book, John Andrew Morrow implies that he met Campagna's children and found out more about their family, but whatever he learned, they didn't want him to go public with it. Anyway, just as the FBI found out, in 1916, Fred Dodd moved from Oregon to Los Angeles. Upon arriving, he began going by Wally Dodd Ford. Why? Maybe he had trouble with the law, but if he did, no record of that survives today. Maybe the Italian guys his ex-wife had fallen in with had mob ties. I hate to stereotype, but Italians in America in the 1910s running illegal alcohol supply chains, sneaking out to do unexplained things at night and possibly sleeping with a young married Native American woman? This was before Prohibition, but still, that could be why Fred Dodd got the hell out of Oregon. In 1917, we get the first instance of Dodd explicitly claiming to be a foreigner. His World War I draft card, in which, once again, he said he was born in the non-existent Shinka, Afghanistan. In context, you know exactly what he was really doing. In 1919, Dodd married Hazel Barton, and they both officially took the surname Ford. They had a child, Wallace Dodd Ford Jr., who would later die in World War II. This marriage was also short-lived, as Barton left with their infant son when she discovered Dodd lived under a series of aliases and hadn't been honest with her. Wallace D. Ford, as he will be known for now, since that's the name he used at the time, powered through, running a restaurant in downtown LA at 3rd and Flower Streets. He had a third brief marriage in the early 1920s with the aforementioned Mexican-born Carmen Trevino. This time he had to claim he was Hispanic in order to marry her, but nobody today seriously believes Ford was really Hispanic. By this point, he was just a skilled ethnic chameleon. Presumably he had dark hair and bronzed enough skin that he could live as the white person that he apparently was most of the time, but he could also claim he was something else when it was convenient. In 1926, though, Ford was busted. His booming cafe at 3rd and Flower was revealed to be a drug front. A police sting operation revealed $5,000 of heroin and cocaine concealed in his shop, which would be about $90,000 today. Intriguingly, a newspaper article about the bust described Ford as a, quote, well-known street corner politician. Others from around that time claim he was a socialist activist, but certainly not someone with racial or religious overtones in his activism. Yet. And why did he go from the hard-working, sober, and industrious man he supposedly was back in Oregon to a Los Angeles drug dealer? Divorce changes a man. It's possible that Fard got himself addicted to cocaine. One of his Nation of Islam associates in his Detroit years claims that Fard told him he was diabetic and kept packets of sugar in his coat in case his blood sugar ran low. But people with diabetes also require regular injections of insulin, and artificial insulin was first invented in 1922. Before that, diabetic people just died. If Fard had diabetes, he couldn't have survived long enough without insulin until it was invented when he was already an adult. Those packets of sugar were probably something else that looks like sugar. After the drug bust, Fard was incarcerated in San Quentin State Prison in the Bay Area, alongside a partner in crime named Edward Donaldson, who despite his name was apparently Chinese American. Donaldson eventually cleaned up his act and lived a long, quiet life in San Diego, dying in 1982. He most likely took valuable information about Fard's background and religious awakening with him to the grave. The FBI never found him, nor did any other Nation of Islam biographers, until he had long died. What's known, though, is that by the time Fard got out of prison in 1929, he had gone most of the way down the path to becoming Wallace Fard Muhammad. Now he was claiming to be a Muslim and made his way to Chicago to join the Moorish Science Temple of America. What had changed him behind bars was unclear. San Quentin's racially diverse inmate population was heavily segregated in those days, so Morrow speculates that since Fard had false documents asserting he was from Afghanistan, he was thrown in with the few other Muslim or quote-unquote Muslim inmates. Those happened to be black followers of the Moorish Science Temple. When the newly free Wallace D. Fard arrived in Chicago, taking on the name David Fordell as a member of the Moorish Science Temple, he allegedly already had some recognition as a Moorish preacher on the West Coast, possibly gained behind the walls of San Quentin. Another strange detail about Fard's well-documented days, the period when he was preaching in Detroit, were his ties to Imperial Japan. I hinted at that earlier, but I couldn't find a way to cram it in until now. There was a Japanese person named Sadokata Takahashi who preached alongside Fard in Detroit in the early days of the NOI, attempting to recruit NOI members into something called the Pacific Movement of the Western World, an esoteric group that tried to start a pro-Japanese movement among African Americans, painting Japan as the liberator of colonized peoples, in hope that, in the event of war between the US and Japan, Black Americans would rise up and overthrow the US from within, instituting a Japanese puppet regime, which is good fodder for a really racist alternate history novel. If Morrow's book is to be believed, Takahashi's real name was Naka Nakana, and he had emigrated from Japan to Canada around 1900, when he was in his 20s, and then from there to Tacoma, Washington, around 1920. Morrow speculated Fard may have first met him on a trip back to the Pacific Northwest, during his period as a drug runner and restaurateur in LA. Either way, Nakana was a strong ally of Fard in his Detroit days, and most historians today believe that he was in the pay of the Japanese Empire itself, part of a detailed, organized program to create internal racial strife in America. After Fard disappeared, Nakano was arrested and deported back to Japan. He re-entered the US via Canada, where he had citizenship, and kept spreading pro-Japanese propaganda until he was arrested and deported again in 1939. Nakana's contributions to the NOI are believed to amount to having written the text of a loyalty pledge given to new converts, and the inclusion of Japanese people in NOI lore as the creators of the Mother Plane and a member of God's chosen races. Speaking of Fard or Ford's disappearance, we still don't know what happened there, but we know the first place he went after he initially vanished in Detroit, and this is the strongest piece of evidence linking the Fred Dodd and Wally Dodd Fard of the West Coast to Wallace Fard Muhammad. Remember Hazel Barton, mother of Wallace Dodd Fard Jr.? Well, in 1934, she was still living in LA, still raising her now 12-year-old son, when, surprise, surprise, her shifty, mysterious ex-husband knocked on her door once again. He was driving an expensive car. The back seat was loaded with white gowns, which he described to her, quote, as religious garments, but he no longer had any use for them. Hazel was baffled to find pamphlets in the car attacking white people as a race of devils. She chased him out of her life, and she never saw him again. It wasn't until 1939, when Hazel read about the arrest of Sarokata Takahashi / Naka Nakane in an article that linked him with the Nation of Islam and included photos of Wallace Fard Muhammad, that she realized, wait, she had married a cult leader. And that was the last anyone ever heard of Wallace Fard Muhammad. The FBI speculates that at that point he skipped the country. In 1942, the FBI caught wind that he was in Japan. In 1953, he was rumored to be preaching at a Nation of Islam temple in New York. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner asserted that he'd been seen in 1963 on a ship from California to New Zealand. In the 1970s, Elijah Muhammad's son, Warith Deen Muhammad, reported that Muhammad Abdullah, an aging Muslim preacher in the Bay Area of Indo-Pakistani origin, was actually Fard under a new name, but there's enough documentation of every step of Muhammad Abdullah's life that everyone's pretty confident this is false. So, is that the guy's story, as best we have it? Seems like it, right? So, he was a white guy all along, never was anything else. He was born in Washington State in 1887 under the name Fred Dodd and lived in Salem, Oregon when he was young, where his life started to unravel, and gradually his life experiences pointed him on the strange and twisted path to becoming a black nationalist cult leader. Except that Fred Dodd died in 1972 in Salem and is buried there next to his wife Mary, and there's a long paper trail from phone book and employment records proving that he was living in Salem, working as a chauffeur for his entire life, including the period that Wally Dodd Ford was selling drugs in LA, the period he was incarcerated, and his Detroit years. So where the hell did Wally Dodd Ford come from? Morrow is pretty confident that as far back as 1914, we do have our guy. The guy who married and then divorced Pearl Allen in Salem in 1914 is the same guy who later became Wallace Fard Muhammad. But he was not the white, Washington-born man named Fred Dodd, who also lived in Salem at the same time. Our Fred Dodd was not a white American after all. He had already had quite a bit of adventure in his life by the time he married Pearl Allen. The smoking gun is that in 1914, in Salem, Fred Dodd ran a tamale cart. This should make you go, wait, so was he Hispanic? No. According to Morrow, he was genuinely Afghan, or maybe from British India. Oregon was awfully diverse in those days, possibly more diverse than it is now, and the largest minority ethnic groups were not the same ones Oregon has now. I once came across a series of articles from around 1910 in which people in various Oregon towns were complaining about, quote, gypsies camping near town and stirring up trouble. I figured this had to mean like drifters, hobos, not actual ethnically Romani people. No way were there Romanis practicing their traditional way of life on the move in 1910s Oregon. And then I came across a much more detailed, better researched article about Oregon's Romani community, which is apparently to this day the biggest in America. And yes, sure enough, traveling Romani caravans were a common sight in 1910s Oregon. Another very visible immigrant group in Oregon in those days were the tamale people, who were not Mexicans. There was sort of a craze for tamales at the time. Every prime street corner in an Oregon city was occupied by a tamale cart, and the tamale industry was run by people who the newspapers called Afghans, who were mostly actually from Punjab in India. This was before the partition of British India into India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, so Punjabis were about equally as likely to be Hindus, Muslims, or Sikhs. The papers casually, detachedly covered battles between rival tamale vendors for control of important spots, which often took on religious undertones, with rivalries between Hindu-run tamale carts and Muslim-run tamale carts especially common. I've heard about how in Yuba City, California, there's a mixed Punjabi-Mexican ethnic group who have Indian-Mexican fusion food. My dad, who grew up in Chico and sometimes played teams from Yuba City on his high school football team, would sometimes go to a long-defunct Indian-Mexican restaurant that used to be the biggest fixture in Yuba City, but I had no idea how not unique that was. How the history of Mexican food in the Pacific Northwest, too, is tied up with Desi immigrants. John Andrew Morrow, tracing the immigration records of young men who arrived in the Northwest from British India around the dawn of the 20th century, believes that the future Wallace Fard Muhammad was known as Alam Khan, short for Khani Alam Khan, when he stepped off the SS Tremont in Port Townsend, Washington, on October 7, 1904. The Tremont had sailed from Hong Kong. From there, Khan may have taken a different ship from Karachi, in today's Pakistan, although he also claimed later on, in applying for naturalization in Oregon, that he was born in Hong Kong. And he might have been, since there were a lot of Indians there, especially Muslim ones, back in the days when both places were part of the British Empire. Alam Khan went into the same business that everyone from his background went into at that time and place. He surfaced running a tamale cart in Salem, just a few months off the boat, then rooming in Spokane, Washington, with a few other tamale salesmen with the surname Khan, possibly his brothers, although we can't be sure, until all the tamale men were banned from Spokane on probably racially motivated charges of being unsanitary. "Tamale men are banished," bellowed the Spokane press. "One righteous lot failed to save Sodom, and naturally one righteous tamale peddler is too much of a minority to save the rest of his kind in Spokane. This conclusion is drawn from the charitable assumption that there must be at least one righteous tamale vendor hereabouts, but whether there is or not, Chief Rice has issued an edict of banishment against the hot stuff retailers, one and all, who move about the night. The lid is on him." January 21st, 1908. Alam Khan and the other Khans decamped to the thriving mining town of Butte, Montana, also the setting of the thrilling final scene of the first season of Jetlag the Game. In Butte, the violent sectarianism that was all too common among tamale vendors of the time and place reared its ugly head, and within a year, nearly everyone who sold tamales in town was either dead, jailed, or banished forever. One tamale-slinging Punjabi married a local white woman, only to discover after the wedding that she was the town's highest-earning prostitute, and of all the tamale vendors in Butte, Montana circa 1908, that guy may have had the best year. Alam Khan made his way back to Oregon, where he started to go by Fred Waldad. He started his own tamale cart right here in Eugene, in my hometown, where he became a beloved local fixture known as Fred the Turk. In those days, Turk just meant Muslim in America, and our hero never personally claimed to be Turkish at any point in his life. The Eugene Guard and the Eugene Morning Register, the two rival newspapers that would eventually merge into the Register Guard, reported on Fred the Turk and his tamale stand as if they were the Quickie and he was Christian, detailing his every move. When he moved the location of his stand from the corner of 6th and Willamette to the corner of 7th and Olive, that was in the paper. When hooligans smashed up his stand on Halloween night, that was in the paper. Once, the Morning Register reported that Fred the Turk, quote, "went to Portland yesterday on business." That was it. That was the article. There sure was not a lot happening in Eugene in 1909. In spring 1909, Fred the Turk filed to obtain U.S. citizenship. He spelled his preferred name two separate ways on his declaration of intention, beginning the statement, "I, Wally Fred Dad," and ending it, "Signed, Wally Fired Dad." He left Eugene later that year and cropped up selling tamales in Wenatchee, Washington, and Kalispell, Montana, often with other people surnamed Khan who may have been family members. In 1911, he returned to the first place he'd lived after arriving in America, Salem, Oregon, running clever and quirky ads for his tamale stand in the local newspapers. "I bet $10 this time of year that chicken tamales are good for your wife. Fred kills 6 fat hens and 12 other things to make tamales. Will do your wife more good than if you spent $100 to get something for your health." Two constant themes in his advertising were that he wasn't hawking these tamales to you, he was hawking them to your wife, and he was perpetually betting the readers of his ads various specific sums of money that his tamales were good and his stand was clean. Fred began selling fresh fruit, which police began harassing him over because he needed a separate permit for that. But he was such a fixture in town that he got them to stop just by writing letters to the newspapers complaining. He began catering weddings and taking orders by phone, the latter of which made his stand one of the first restaurants in the Northwest and possibly America to do so. In 1913, Fred the Turk got arrested in Salem for rizzing up a married woman. That was literally the charge. Mrs. Laura E. Swanson, a woman who says she came to this city from Newburgh with her husband a short time ago, was induced to leave her spouse and go with Dodd on the promises of fine clothes and high living. We now know why Fred was targeting his advertising to your wife. The promises of fine clothes and high living may not have been spurious either. Fred's bail was set at $1,000, which would have been over $25,000 today. Fred paid it in cash. His business must have been getting hugely successful. The courts found that yes, Fred and Laura E. Swanson had indeed had sex, but it was consensual, and while kind of scummy on both participants' parts, him rizzing her up and her cheating on her husband was not a legal matter. Fred slung out surreally hilarious ads for his stand, now curiously known as Fred's Night Lunch, throughout 1914 and 1915, even as his personal life, as we've previously discussed, was falling apart. As World War I became the main thing on most people's minds, he wanted 14,000 men to read war news at Fred's Night Lunch. That's about the total population of Salem at the time. Lost dogs can be found at Fred's Night Lunch. War! Germans capture 6 million. Fred capture 6 French fried chickens at Fred's Night Lunch. This was World War I. Not as tasteless as that specific statistic would become. Still pretty tasteless, though. Runaway chickens captured at Fred's Night Lunch. Found! Check $70 belongs to J.W. Lamimaugamaugaranmanum. Even Morrow is baffled at what that one could possibly mean. Clearly, that's not someone's real name. Morrow thought it could be an anagram meant as a coded message to someone, but he couldn't find anything that worked. Finally, all of a sudden, Fred closed up shop and left Salem, popping up later in Los Angeles under a new name. By now, you know the rest. Where was he from? Tracing his origin through the chaotic 1910s Pacific Northwest tamale industry, which is something I really never expected to know so much about, I think Morrow has come up with a plausible background for him. But where did he come from before he stepped off that boat? One name that comes up alongside Fred, Ford, or Fard's various names in his early tamale-selling days is Shere Khan. Yes, the same name as the tiger in the Jungle Book. Shere Khan, who ran a tamale stand in Portland and later in Eugene, both for far longer than Fred ever ran a stand in one place, has been identified by a handful of different sources as Fred's older brother. Shere Khan seemed to be less of a charismatic con man than his brother, and in 1917, he applied for U.S. citizenship. He listed his birthplace as Balochistan, a province in the west of what's now Pakistan, bordering Afghanistan and Iran. And since nobody from Balochistan had ever applied for citizenship in Oregon before, and possibly the whole US, the court had to make a decision on whether Balochis are white enough to get US citizenship. They ruled that they aren't. Fred, Ford, or Fard went a different path when he applied for citizenship, claiming on his form that he was born in Hong Kong, not mentioning once where his family roots came from, and, as a total red herring, renouncing allegiance to the King of Spain, which may have made the courts think he was a globe-trotting Spaniard. It worked for him. Shere Khan got his happy ending too, becoming a US citizen after World War II and dying in 1966, at a respectable 81 years old. Turns out he's buried at a cemetery within walking distance from where I live, one of the last surviving memories of an immigrant community I had no idea we had in Oregon that far back. I don't know if he ever had any children. One of my closest friends in Eugene these days is Pakistani American, but his parents arrived in America in the 90s, and I doubt he ever knew his people had been here for over a century. I'll be honest, I don't know if I buy the story that Wallace Fard Muhammad came from a Muslim background. The elements of Twelver Shia Islam, a very esoteric sect that he included in the NOI's mythology, the Council of 24 Imams is very similar to mystic beliefs in Twelver Shia, but the whole rest of his religion has less than nothing to do with Islam. If he was from Balochistan or maybe nearby Afghanistan, he could well have been a Twelver Shia, but what about the stuff about Yaqub creating white people and the mother plane and the de-emphasis of Muhammad? The more I work on this episode, the more I'm noticing parallels to the subject of the next Tourist Cabinet episode. Another man who started a strange, unique religion that he claimed was inspired by one of the world's major religions, but was really its own thing. That other guy, who you'll be hearing about pretty soon, claims he had a vision where he was visited by divine entities that didn't match up with any religion he knew, and only much later on did he apply the basic concepts of an existing religion around it. Maybe that's what happened to Fred Dodd. Maybe sometime, either around 1915 in Oregon or in San Quentin in the 1920s, he felt like something had reached out and touched him. He tried to make his vision fit the religion he knew, Islam, but it didn't. Maybe he really did believe in what he preached after all. There's still a lot we don't know about Fard. After he unsuccessfully tried to reconnect with Hazel Barton in LA, we have no idea where he disappeared off to. Elijah Muhammad ran the Nation of Islam for years as it grew and grew, and became part of the burgeoning civil rights movement. Like many strange movements, it was beset by infighting, sometimes violent, which eventually claimed the life of one of its most charismatic preachers, Malcolm X. There are a lot of people who still say the FBI killed Malcolm X, and they definitely snooped on him. I'm sure the FBI was happy to see him gone, but the fact is, they didn't need to assassinate him. In the 1960s, mainstream Islam was becoming better known in the West, and Nation of Islam members were realizing, often for the first time in their lives, that what they were practicing was not Islam. Malcolm X converted to mainstream Sunni Islam and began criticizing the NOI as a bunch of un-Islamic weirdos. For a year, he was under constant death threats from NOI members, and while it's not clear who eventually pulled the trigger, several different members of the NOI openly swore to kill him. In the aftermath of the NOI's 1960s Day in the Sun, Elijah Muhammad's son, Warith Deen Muhammad, took control of the NOI in 1975 and moved it away from Fard's bizarre teachings, closer to mainstream Islam. Others criticized this move, and a former Calypso singer and NOI member, Louis Farrakhan, re-established the NOI with all its janky old beliefs, plus a heaping dose of anti-Semitism a few years later. He's been in charge of the main sect ever since. They have never been on good terms with other Muslims, who they attack as old Islam and white people's Islam. Maybe that's the American dream. Who ever heard of a religion about black nationalism and pulpy mad science tales calling itself Islam? Well, who ever heard of a Pakistani immigrant selling tamales? I've never been too keen on the whole cultural appropriation discourse because mixing and matching cultures is the lifeblood of a nation of immigrants. It's gotten America some of the world's best food, music, festivals, and yes, bizarro religions. Here in the world's great melting pot, you can be anything.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. The loaded question will break your bones. What puts you on your knees? You paint the walls in red, the color of your heart. But the man in gray will get you now. You've got to hide or take the blame. Want to reach your friends, but they break the ties you had. You know.
Oh my god!